as we transition from Book 1 of Native Son to Book 2, entitled Flight. One of the most prevalent changes in the psychology of the protagonist, Bigger Thomas, is his transition from the id to the ego and attempted transition from a philosophy of existentialism to determinism. He begins to see and understand the manner in which the black population is usurped by white enterprisers, an observation exacerbated by his flight from enclosing police and the transition from the id to the ego, or shadow to self. Following his partial transition from these psychological archetypes and philosophies, he sees the white world tilted at a sharp angle and is able to discern the blindness of others, yet is still masked by his own blindness and overconfidence, as he is unable to predict that he will be discovered as Mary Dalton's murderer. In contrast with the earlier book, in which his actions were based in animalistic instinct in protection of the Jungian shadow as he looked around the room wildly and marked his actions with a brutish, heavy grunt, he now approaches them more logically and clinically, as shown in the dissection of his alibi for the night of Mary's murder in order to make it foolproof. This reflects the Jungian theory of evolution from the shadow, one's animalistic self, to the self, or the state of true realization. Although Bigger does not fully facilitate this transition, he recognizes and eventually makes peace with the fact that he had killed Mary, coming to terms with the recurrent image of her bloody head with its curly black hair as a representation of his ability to execute the actions necessary to facilitate proper racial change. The text of Flight contains both a literal and figurative awakening for the Bigger Thomas character. His world is physically illuminated by the dawn, which greets him at the beginning of the book, and with this awakening he finds himself stronger in personal identity and apparently conscious of the blindness which characterizes all those surrounding him, as well as his own id. He describes those around him as sleeping, quite literally, yes, but also sleeping within the context of their delusion of placidity and passive acceptance of squalor. He notes the tiredness of his mother and sister as they work throughout their flat, commenting on the effect of their toxically oppressive environment and the manner in which it influences behavior. He also notes this same tiredness in Bessie, criticizing her use of sex and alcohol as methods of escape. Wright is highly critical of these female characters, as well as Mrs. Dalton and Mary Dalton, exemplifying their state of constant falsehood. Mrs. Dalton's metaphorical blindness is criticized, as she is physically unable to discern skin color and yet perpetually treats Bigger in an inferior manner. Mary, a false disciple of communism, and by extension, analogous to a false disciple of Christianity, blatantly tries to relate to Bigger in a non-discriminatory fashion, resulting in her own accidental racism, which is culminated in her botched recitation of Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. Additionally, it is quite plain that Mrs. Dalton and her husband utilized their family tragedy to gain personal publicity, as evident when they pose for photographers in the midst of Bigger's disguised request for a ransom to be paid for Mary Dalton's return. Mrs. Dalton is constantly described as a spectacle or specter, making a show of her entrances, descriptors which exemplify the manner in which both the woman and her husband usurp the unfortunaty of others to magnify their benevolent and gracious image. Upon his discovery of the titles of the communist pamphlets entitled Race and Prejudice on Trial and Black and White Unite and Fight, Bigger is able to manipulate the blindness of those around him, as he realizes that the idea of racial unity, which he and his brethren had placidly accepted as an unrealistic fantasy, did not seem so dangerous. These ideas are later mirrored in Bigger's Daydream, in which he fantasizes about the potential for black revolt. However, communism was enticing to those who, like the black population, experienced oppression daily and were eager for a sense of equality. This was appalling to the white population of the day, a fact clearly acknowledged by Bigger when he deliberately places suspicion of guilt on Jan by discussing topics he knew that white reporters would find ridiculous, such as that one day there would be no rich folks and poor folks, no more lynching, and that a black man would have a chance. Bigger is able to play the opinions of the reporters against the investigation itself, using the polarizing views of the Communist Party to create a general mistrust of Jan. However, he also finds himself stymied by the blindness of those around him, both physically and ideologically. As he attempts to reach the dresser in his flat, the symbol of the ultimate goal of self-determination, he questions how this is possible with the bed upon which his mother and sister slept standing squarely in the way, the bed symbolizing traditional obstacles which faced his race and essentially dictated his future. He finds the same frustration with Bessie, knowing that he could not leave her and he could not take her with him, both his family and his purely physical love acting as obstacles standing between his original blindness and his ultimate goal, the ability to effectively control his destiny and sequential choices. Bessie serves as Bigger's anima, reflecting the sexual extremism with which he views her and her two faces. Much like the earlier movie theater scene, Bigger uses Bessie to facilitate sexual release from his surrounding oppression, seeing her body as a distracting object and vehicle to provide momentary relief. However, he is brought back to the reality of his downtrodden state by her face, a face of tiredness reflecting hours of toil, frustration, alcohol abuse, and utter hopelessness. He finds her in this manner too weak to accompany him on his journey, much as the rest of his family, and is forced to leave them all in the dust to pursue his greater cause. And yet, he cannot shake one of the secondary characters. The white cat, Kate, is constantly drawn to Bigger as a moth to the proverbial flame. An embodiment of society, the cat leaped and sat perched on Bigger's shoulder, metaphorically exposing him and foreshadowing his eventual capture and indictment. Yet this multifaceted symbol can retain far greater meaning. As the cat clenches his shoulder, refusing to let go, Bigger questions, "Why can't that cat leave me alone?" This falls directly parallel to the attempts of white society to help the black belt, in the process belittling the race and spotlighting it as something of an oddity. He expresses earlier that it seemed that this white man held him up now to look at him and be amused. Testimony intended to side the audience in concurrence with Wright's view that white efforts to facilitate racial equality are largely ineffective and unintentionally result in the exposition of the black race. In such a manner, Wright uses the secondary characters as toys which either aid or harm his protagonist. Moving through the scene changes, Bigger quite blatantly states the fact that he is now capable of discerning the blindness around him, which clouds the judgment of the supplementary characters. He describes those around him with similes which characterize their manipulatable nature. Buddy is labeled as a chubby puppy, Vera as a dog, and Bessie as a rabbit. These descriptions, those of helpless animals known for their blind loyalty, exemplify Bigger's growing consciousness of the blindness surrounding him and his growing notion that black pacificity will not resolve interracial dilemma. Bigger also notes the blindness of the white community and plays this apparent blindness to his advantage, believing that no member of the white community would believe that he would be so audacious to murder and burn a rich white girl. However, it is notable that even as Bigger perceives himself as completely rid of his former blindness, he is blind to his potential for failure. Within his divided room, Bigger examines the manner in which he may attempt to control the proceedings of the investigation of Mary's disappearance, completely blind to the fact that he is wildly incapable of articulating future events, as indicated by the later discovery of Mary's unburnt bones in the furnace. He recognizes that he is unable to fully rise to the land of the living, the determinists, and is stuck in a kind of limbo or no man's land. Throughout the latter half of the text, Bigger often struggles to retain physical consciousness as he metaphorically begins to slip back into the existentialist philosophy, still futilely attempting to maintain his partial determinist footing. Under structurally and rhetorically focused lenses, Wright's work largely fails, with the exception of heavy amounts of layered symbolism and foreshadowing. With the cat as a metaphor for the whole of white society who would indict Bigger, the image of the cat pouncing on his shoulder portends his future accusation and capture as the murder of Mary Dalton. The image of the white water tower at the book's conclusion conveys a slightly different connotation, as it provides a rare glimpse of a black victim of white society asserting dominance over his oppressors through the symbolic climb and mounting of the massive white object by a black man. The scene in which the tower is contained, that surmising the chase across ghetto rooftops, is the equivalent of the battle of the black population to obtain the most basic civil rights. Each building and gap represents not only the literal hurdles Bigger faces, but the metaphorical hurdles faced by the entirety of the African American population as they champion their cause. However, as Bigger is overcome by his white counterparts, Wright exemplifies the fact that black efforts to champion civil rights will ultimately fail, equality being grossly unattainable. He parallels this factor in Jan's earlier solicitation of members of the black population as a mechanism through which the Communist Party might gain greater influence, blatantly not out of consideration for their plight. As this commentary precedes Wright's alienation from the party, it directly attempts to elicit a response from the audience affirming the notion that no ideology has the capacity to incite racial equality with absolute equity, no matter its seemingly pure intent. Throughout all of this, Wright conveys the futility of revolt. He displays the necessity for racial placidity, arguing positively for the incitement of an easing of racial lines. However, no matter the degrees to which the black man pleads his cause, he is surrounded by a sea of snow. As Bigger Thomas, Wright finds the necessity to eventually cave to the snow's cruel will, accepting that the status quo will consistently be maintained and racial advocacy bulldozed by the white majority.